Hi, I'm Timmy Kale. I'm the membership manager at WRKF. If you are a member of WRKF, thank you so much for your contribution. You keep us on the air. Literally 90% of our operating budget comes from donations from the community. If you are not a member yet, but you would like to be, you're welcome to stop out at our table on your way out, or you can grab some swag to show off your support. So WRKF, as you know, is home to such places, such shows like Science Cafe, TED Radio Hour, Hidden Brain. We've got a 24-hour classical channel on HD2 if you have an HD radio, or you can go on WRKF.org and listen, where you can also find a schedule of all of our programming. At the end of today's show, Dr. Beck will pull a name from those who pre-registered for the show, and you can sport this nice public radio nerd tumbler that you can, You're all public radio nerds just because you're here. So you can listen while you listen to Karen, drinking while you listen to Karen Henderson at Morning Edition and so on. And on behalf of Baton Rouge Public Radio, thank you so much for being here and thank you for listening. Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Timmy. Thank you so much. And now, without further ado, let me introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Shannon Walsh is head of the PhD Theater Program and faculty rector for the Visual and Performing Arts Residential College at LSU. Her edited volume, Sporting Performance, Politics in Play, examines the intersections between theater and sport and physical culture across the world and in history. She received her MA in Theater Studies from Florida State and her PhD in Theater Historiography from the University of Minnesota. After the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. To participate, simply raise your hand and we'll ask a question. But if you're on our WRKF Facebook live stream, then just simply ask the question through the comment section and we'll relay the questions here in the theater. And without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Shannon Walsh.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We thought that we would start off actually with a scene. So amazingly enough, even though school is not in session and some of these folks have graduated, we are going to start with a scene from the play The Wolves for you. It's about 4 minutes long. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my amazing cast of The Wolves to give you a quick scene from that play.
It is the Cambodian thing, just to be old. You know, like people, I think like shame, like social chives. No, it's starting with that. I'm pretty sure it started with that. No, I don't feel bad. I just, yeah, wow. I don't feel bad. I just think it's, thousands of feet. What I meant was like, it was horrible. Obviously, he was horrible. It is horrible. Okay, it is horrible. Not like, what if you did something horrible today, but you didn't think it? Let me finish. It was horrible. It was an atrocity, right? Yeah, it was. But you were like saving your country, like destroying the enemy to save your own people. Right. What do you think after that? Like, college, got married, had kids, grandkids. You wanted, like, 90. On the verge of death, like emphysema. That's it. And somehow not support. You know what you did? And guess what? You're going to prison for life. My grandma has a for life. He's only going to prison for life. Yeah, he's 9. He's going to die soon. Old one's already dead. Those of the big ones already dead. Remember Las Vegas Showcase last year? Let's go. We were like, shoot on Michael. I just never know, baby. More than a racket. So stupid young they look like school buses. Yeah, school buses. School buses. All right, we should get going. Coach is waiting. Coach, shit. Oh, that's right. He is so hungover. It's embarrassing. Like, let's see, wear those stupid athletic sunglasses inside on a Saturday morning. Definitely. Sweet. Definitely still wait. Yeah, you sound. I feel so good for this. I don't want you to not sick. Okay? Just like, right. All right, so that's it. Ew, gross. That happens to me and my sister.
All right, give them a round of applause. And then bear with us as we transition. And then Julie, I think it's slide 3. We can start there. Awesome. So The Wolves was only our second show since the shutdown to be performed in person at LSU since the pandemic shut us down and shut down most of our productions in spring of 2020. Our students and production folks and I had been waiting for a long time to put up this show, which was announced in spring of 2020. And while all of us had waited for this show with eager anticipation, it was an experience of fits and starts. We were out of practice. The usual routines had gotten foggy and commitments had shifted with the ongoing crises. That said, this show and the people involved in it were my buoy this past spring semester. I had never looked forward to rehearsals, never enjoyed watching bonds formed among the cast, never come home each night with a light inside my soul as much as I did during this rehearsal process. For me, it's no accident that the show that created this intense sense of belonging is about soccer. Talking about the similarities between sports and theater is my jam. The parallels between players and actors and coaches and directors and fields and stages. Both theater and sports are also foundational community building events. And we certainly see that in this play. Through the pleasures and pains of high school, these soccer players rely on the routines and banter and care of their teammates to get them through everything from term papers on Armenia and feminine hygiene product choices to eating disorders and grief. And regardless of their in-process identities and social status off the field, on the field, they and their teammates and the game are known and comforting quantities to them. Spaces like these often allow people to find the truest versions of themselves, selves that are often marginalized elsewhere in the warmth of belonging. Theater is often the place where people who have difficulty belonging in more traditional spaces find their family too. But that belonging carries risk. What happens when the only place that you feel your truest self, the strongest sense of belonging, becomes inaccessible, like it was during the pandemic, or worse, toxic? Which is why so many people have such strong feelings about sports and theater. The stakes of belonging or not belonging are so high when you feel ostracized elsewhere. It's the communal aspect, the collective work that sports and theater do that I want to talk to you about today. And that is the focus of my current work. As I'm going to talk to you about today, it's my firm belief that arenas like sports and theater have a lot to teach us about how to get along across difference. That commonality marks these fields as crucial as we move into these latter phases of the pandemic, but also as we emerge into what many scholars in both the humanities and the sciences refer to as the Anthropocene, big word, which is the geological age where human activity becomes the greatest influence on our planet and our environment. The lessons that we learn through these activities in the arts and sports can tell us so much about how to navigate the complexities of our future existence. And in order to understand how these fields might impact our future survival, that's right, I think actors and athletes might save us. It's important to think about sports and the arts not merely as entertainments, luxuries, or leisure activities, but rather as barometers of who we are as a culture, what we care about, and places where we can imagine a better, more just world into being. Next slide. Sweet. So, what do sports and theater have in common, and why should it matter to you? Normally, when I talk about this, I talk about similarities and differences between these fields, but for today, I just want to focus on the idea of community and collectivity, and I'm going to focus on similarities in spaces, sociocultural structures, and audience impact. So when I was an undergrad, one of my favorite professors, a somewhat feeble, older, white-haired, balding white man who always wore cardigans and often acted out his lesson plans in theater history, would wistfully tell us about how he secretly yearned to suit up for the Denver Broncos for just one play so that he could have some sense of what it must have felt like to be an actor on a stage like the one at Epidaurus in Greece. The dichotomous imagery of such an imagining stuck in my brain for good teacher. Now, Epidaurus's capacity of 15,000 is no match for Tiger Stadium's 102,321. But this man's longing for a time when theater matched or exceeded the popularity of sports stuck with me. Theater and sports spaces can tell us a lot about ourselves and what we value as a community. In Greece, theaters were stitched into the environment, etched into hillsides and reliant on nature's lighting. At Epidaurus, the entire community gathered to watch drama that some scholars argue was actually meant to teach citizens how to better govern their cities. It was an event that was as much about being seen as it was about watching the play, like Saturdays in the fall in Baton Rouge, where tailgating, Tiger Band parading, Call in Baton Rouge singing is as important, if not more important than the game itself. The activities surrounding the performance of Greek dramas served as one of the primary community gatherings in Greek citizens' lives. The architecture of the spaces meant that audiences looked at their fellow community members, understanding literally where they sat in their social hierarchy, and they came together to support the people who put on those plays. The structure of our stadiums and the social rules that dictate how people occupy those spaces tells folks who belongs to the home team and who does not. Because here's the trick about community building. When you set up boundaries and rules for who belongs and how to belong, it means that you will, whether you intend it or not, exclude people. In ancient Greece, that meant excluding folks who were not citizens, and that included women, enslaved people, and foreigners. And at Tiger Stadium, it means Alabama fans. Next slide. So the architecture and human geography affect the sociocultural structures of those who participate in theater and sports. This has been the focus of my work up to this point. So how do activities like sports and physical fitness routines affect our identities, how we think, feel, and move through the world? So my first book focuses on how women's physical fitness practices, right there, dumbbell girl, physical fitnesses in the 19th and early 20th centuries worked to shape women's habits of femininity and whiteness. Additionally, I suggest that these exercises and the folks who taught them in the US were supremely concerned with and interested in shaping white women's bodies to be better at making babies. In other words, these teachers and gyms that sprouted up all over the country during this time gave women such freedom. Women-only spaces in which to bond together to feel strong in mind and in body, and were simultaneously bent on tethering them to domesticity. So how can exercises do that? By having women perform exercises that are focused primarily on their back, abdominals, and hips, while preventing them from engaging in more strenuous work of the legs and the arms, and banning them entirely from competitive sports. So how then, I ask in my more recent work on contemporary sports and physical fitness, does that eugenic legacy affect me when I do a CrossFit workout? Yep, that's me doing a CrossFit workout, right? So eugenics, we've heard that term bandied about a lot recently. In the late 19th and early 20th century, it literally means good breeding. And the way that it was defined was it was about encouraging those who were considered fit to breed with other people who were considered fit, and to discourage breeding with people who were considered unfit. And it was from things to like marriage manuals and motherhood manuals, like as innocuous as that, all the way to sort of forced sterilizations, mostly of marginalized communities. So it was a wide swath of stuff. So in my work on CrossFit, I suggest that if fitness at the end of the 19th century encouraged women towards domesticity, can we not create a practice today that physically helps all women embody and practice social justice and cultural equity? Can we not have sports and physical fitness for social change in the same way that we have a thriving field of theater for social change? Next slide. So how exactly do theater and sports and fitness help enact social change? How do these fields impact their audiences to be better humans together? And why does that matter? Victor Turner, an anthropologist specializing in human rituals, described moments during rituals when the participants would simultaneously experience a feeling of deep belonging, togetherness, and equality with other participants. He called this experience communitas. Riffing on this idea, performance scholar Jill Dolan suggests that theater audiences regularly have a similar experience when they watch an engaging piece of theater. Furthermore, she suggests that these moments, because they happen in a moment of pretend, allow the audience to glimpse for a second a possible utopia, a world that we wish could be. This moment of performative utopia offers audiences a chance to imagine what a better, more just world might look like, and then sometimes leave the theater and try to put that imagining into action for social change, though my professor never did really make it onto the field for the Broncos. So next slide. So performative utopias proliferate in theater. I have a picture of Hamilton up here because many would argue that its staging of our white founding fathers as Black, Indigenous, and people of color opened doors for the theater world to at least expand its ideas of who can represent whom on stage. In sports, performative utopias enable crowds to see what they have in common and what it feels like to find joy in what we share, our love of the Tigers, rather than ruminate on what divides us. But these utopias are fleeting, Dolan suggests, by their very nature. So what provides the hope for a more just world is how those experiencing the performative utopias use this moment to motivate and inform the work that they then go back and do in the real world and what they create. Next slide. So I'm gonna get a little technical here for a second. What do we as humans, why do we as humans need these performative utopias in sports and theater? Because our world is pretty precarious at the moment and does not look to become less so in the future. Scholars in the humanities and the sciences have been sounding alarms for a long time before COVID about the precariousness of our environmental and cultural futures. Whether it's climate change or the dismantling of democratic structures, we are rapidly adapting to a constant state of precarity. What do we mean? What do I mean when I say precarity? Cultural theorist Lauren Berlant points out that the legal term precarious describes, quote, the situation wherein your tenancy on your land is in someone else's hands, unquote. Performance scholars Rebecca Schneider and Nicholas Ridout expand on this idea and suggest, quote, if precarity is life lived in relation to someone else's hands, it is also newly experienced by many as life lived in relation to a future that cannot be propped up upon the past, unquote. Taken together, the majority of folks live in some form of precarity, whether in their current circumstances or because pasts are extinguished, forgotten, or never visible in the first place. That said, for those that were already in a situation of precarity before COVID, COVID has made that precarity even more dire. While many of us now have a more intimate experience with precarity, actors who are forced to move back home with their parents, contract workers pushed into social welfare programs, living our lives on screens, others have been given a death sentence, which brings me to Necro Politics. In Necro Politics, Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe says, the quiet part of eugenics out loud. He points to the recent global wars, genocides, colonial occupations, and plantations as the central examples, where he argues that necropolitics accounts for, quote, the various ways in which our contemporary world weapons are deployed in the interest of maximally destroying persons and creating death worlds. That is, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to living conditions that confer upon them the status of the living dead. Unquote. For Mbembe, the landscape of the living dead can include a broad swath of environments, from children blinded by rubber bullets to buildings that bring back painful memories of humiliation, interrogations, and beatings. As he says, quote, to live under late modern occupation is to experience a permanent condition of being in pain, unquote. The pandemic has made this imagery even more acute. It is difficult not to see death everywhere these days. What Mbembe's work lays bare is that this was already happening for globally marginalized communities, and the pandemic merely exposed the failures of that system to everyone, everywhere, by revealing the inadequacies of our global healthcare systems and the political entanglements that prevent immediate action. Next slide. What then should we do? Where are we headed, and how can we as artists, as teachers, as athletes, as scholars position ourselves, our students, our friends, our family to be prepared for what's to come? So at the conclusion of his 2016 book, Mbembe asserts, quote, the 21st century opens onto the avowal about the extreme fragility of all and of the capital A, all, end quote. Similarly, in her 2015 book, based on a series of lectures, feminist theorist Judith Butler also points to the necessity of reconceiving of the all of a community in global terms. This necessary unity is, for Butler, driven by the precariousness of our economic, political, and environmental circumstances. In addition, that unity does not require affinity nor affection. Neither she nor Mbembe are calling for some kind of universality or celebratory unity. Rather, as Butler suggests, we have certain ethical obligations that arise from what she calls our unchosen cohabitation. She concludes, quote, we live together because we have no choice. And though we sometimes rail against that unchosen condition, we remain obligated to struggle to affirm the ultimate value of that unchosen social world, an affirmation that is not quite a choice, a struggle that makes itself known and felt precisely when we exercise our freedom in a way that is necessarily committed to the equal value of lives, unquote. Her most recent expansion of these ideas came in Time magazine last summer when they were talking about what does our future look like, where she suggested that the conditions of the pandemic have exposed that tenuous interconnectedness even further. The pandemic, she says, quote, challenges the notion of ourselves as isolated individuals encased in discrete bodies and bound by established borders, unquote. She concludes, quote, as we dismantle the rigid forms of individuality in these interconnected times, we can imagine the smaller part that human worlds must play on this earth whose regeneration we depend on, unquote. In the performing arts, physical culture, fitness, and sports, that collective creation is our superpower. I think of my colleague Kimberly Janarone's work on the early fraternal bonds of Turnverein societies, German gymnastic societies in Eastern Europe, and the ways that working out together also meant working on overthrowing totalitarian regimes. I think about the way in which student athletes instantly thrive in group projects in my classes because collaboration is their ethos. I think about how my student artists instinctively understand the labor involved in producing a football game. They recognize and value all the work at play every Saturday on the football field in Tiger Stadium. They fundamentally connect with the idea of team. And these groups also understand the strategic bonds that make such production possible. Both sets of folks understand that they don't have to agree. They don't even have to like each other in order to make the world of the game, the world of the play happen. Because that is our strength. As artists, as creators, as athletes, as coaches, we weather differences of ideology, of belief, of personality in order to benefit collective creation. Which brings me back to the wolves. The wolves, in the end, suggests that risk and that investment it involves is worth it. When crisis strikes, the team comes together to find solace and laughter and normalcy. At times throughout this production process, rehearsals felt like a sanctuary of focus, of play, of reflection, and even escape from the din of disasters in our collective worlds. That space of temporary but regular refuge and community has brought hope that those things will make their way more regularly into all of our collective spaces soon. Thank you. That's my team. Cool, so questions, answers. I don't have any. Steve's gonna start. Yes, Steve. Awesome, thank you for the question. So just to repeat, for those online, Steve's question was about whether or not everything that I've talked about here, how does that apply to like music and other sort of live performing arts arenas. And right, it's the live performance piece of it that matters, right? I'm the expert in theater, so I can't tell you about music, but I can tell you that I have felt performative utopias at music concerts, right? That I think what's most important is the gathering together piece. I think that it's also been complicated by the pandemic because it wasn't that we were all in our own little, silos in the pandemic either. Like I was live tweeting my experience of watching Ted Lasso. Love Ted Lasso. So I think that you know, there can be an argument that you can experience that same sense of collectivity while you're watching a movie or a TV show online, as long as there's some social aspect to it, right? Like if I'm sitting there and watching somebody live tweet Stranger Things this week, have done, right there, that sense of community is there, but right, that scholarship hasn't been written just yet, because part of what Dolan argues is that it matters that you have to be bodily together to experience that. But I would say, I think concerts, like listening to people talk about that Garth Brooks concert. Who went to that Garth Brooks concert? Anyone? Oh, really? Yeah, right. So listening to people talk about that Garth Brooks concert, everybody described to me that it was a performative utopia. Right? That there was this moment where like everybody felt this incredible sense that they were all together, that Garth Brooks was a part of our family, that everybody around them was a part of their family. Like it was powerful, y'all, at a time that, you know, we needed something like that. So I think that it can happen in all of those places. Other questions? Yes, Jackie. So the question here was, I wonder what role competition has to play in both of these areas. So one of the things that I tell my students about when I try to get them to tease out, like, so what are the differences? So one of the most important differences that I tell them between theater and sports is that sports has an unknown outcome, right? That by and large, when you go to see Hamlet, you know he's not making it till the end. Right? So, but like when you go to watch LSU football play, you don't know, you can intuit, but you don't know. And that actually that unknown quantity makes sports inherently more dramatic than drama. Well, theater people have a really hard time with that. So like the competition part. But I would say, right, that and you can ask these folks down here, the competition part is absolutely there in theater, right? You just don't see it on the stage, because the competition part is when 40 people auditioned for this show, 40 women auditioned for this show, right? Which for us is wild. That is a competition there. But what's amazing is when you talk to athletes about the stress and pressures that they feel, like my son's a goalkeeper for soccer. Don't ever be a goalkeeper's mom. So like the stress and pressure that he feels and the way that he pushes himself and the work that he does and the anxiety he feels is so similar to the way that actors describe auditioning, right? They both have to go through that kind of competition. We just don't stage that competition as overtly as like sports does, which is why you end up with those like debates about like wrestling, right? Professional wrestling, and sports people being like, oh, that isn't sports. There's a pre-planned outcome, and wrestlers being like, it absolutely is sports, and theater people being like, ah, right? So I think competition just adds like an extra dimension, but it's fundamental to sports in a way that we just don't stage it in the arts, I think. Sometimes we do. Competitive improv is a whole nother thing, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not an expert. Yeah, in the back. Sure. So the question here was about the performativity of race and gender, which is from Judith Butler, and how sports and theater can talk to each other about that. So I'll talk a little bit. This talk was actually originally going to be about, there's only one sort of academic article written about this play. And it is a sort of old school feminist who is like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. We're celebrating like young women's lives, and this is all about girlhood and all about yay, being a woman, and that was not our experience of this play at all. Right? That part of what sports, especially in terms of gender performativity. So when he says gender performativity, what the heck does that mean? So Judith Butler, right, says that gender is performative, that That doesn't mean that it's fake. That doesn't mean that we like put on costumes and stuff, but that we learn how to do our gender, that we learn how to move through the world, that we make choices based on being incentivized, based on our bodies and society to go in this direction, to wear heels for a talk, and that race is also sort of performative. So what I found interesting about this play, and it might be because of the people that I did it with, is that I think sports, particularly for people who have been gendered as women, provides a place and a space to safely play with masculinity. And that one of the stories that we told in our version was about how this one character, that place of play, enabled that character to come out by the end of the show. Right, that and that they're one of the things that this author does with this play is that none of the characters are named. They named themselves. There's two that are named, and we don't find out their names until the very end. So all my actors named themselves. They're only known by their numbers. And that also created this space to be really fluid with how we sort of treated gender, but sports does that anyway. Right, my master's thesis talked a lot about homosociality. So homosociality is that dudes can get on a football field and like smack each other's bottoms, and everybody's like, yeah, bro. Right, it becomes reconstructed in that place as like hyper masculine. So there's also ways in which masculinity can be played with in sports in a way that I don't think there are other places that we can do that. Like we can see Tom Brady like cry on like national news because, you know, he's going to retire and then he's not going to retire and then who knows, right? But we can see this hyper masculine dude cry on television and everybody can be like, that's a man, right? So sports opens that place. And I think theater has been playing with gender for a long time. Hello, drag, right? We invented drag. Maybe we didn't invent it, right? But I think that that is something, but right, we always in theater get to sort of hide behind the fact that it's pretend, right? So in places where there, you know, way back when there were riots in theater about, you know, men dressing as women and oh, scandalous, right? The argument they would say was like, whatever, this is just a stage. We don't really do that, even though they were really doing that off stage, right? So again, it created this place of play so that you could play with gender and you could play with race. Now, when it comes to race, right, theater's history is not good, right? We have like blackface minstrelsy that has informed so much of what we do. It is the backbone of musical theater, and musical theater has worked really hard to sort of undo that. But it also means that like the rules in terms of racial performance on stage are not the same as the rules of gender performance on stage. And that's because of violence. That's because of histories about how those things are construed on stage in different ways. That, you know, I had a student once in a class be like, so how can you get up and celebrate drag performance? And say, drag performance is so amazing because it's about men celebrating the performance of femininity, and that's amazing, yay! And yet in the same breath, you can vilify blackface performance, right? And my response was like, blackface performance was never meant to celebrate Black folks, right? It wasn't invented by Black folks. We invented blackface minstrelsy to ridicule, whereas most drag, not all drag, but most drag is about celebrating that femininity, regardless of what kind of body you're in. Sorry, that was a really long. That's like my area, gender, sexuality, race, and performance. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, when did women end up on stage and how did that happen? The answer is it depends. It depends on the culture, and it depends on where you were. Like the French were putting women on stage long before like women were allowed to be on stage in England. So what I can tell you, right, and it was different in Italy, and then like also like men performing women's roles in places like Japan and China is also a whole other ball of wax. Like women performing things like Kathakali in India, like them performing women's roles is literally like so recent, like in the last 2 decades, kind of recent. But what is common about all of them is that once women did start occupying these roles, and it wasn't that women weren't on stage, but they weren't on stage in what we would consider traditional performance. They could be like wandering minstrels or like commedia dell'arte. They could be in commedia dell'arte, but it's because it wasn't considered good or cool. Like it wasn't high art, right? So that once women got on stages, whether it was France, whether it was England, whether it was anywhere else, including China, including Japan, those women's characters were immediately called into question, right? So you'll see if you watch or if you read like oh my gosh, Restoration plays, the actresses are all listed as Mrs. Because if you were going to be an actor on the stage as a woman, you had to prove that you were married. Otherwise, it was assumed that you were a sex worker, right? So and that again, when it comes to playing gender on stage, is why if you put a woman on stage in a breeches role, gosh, it doesn't read the same as if you put a dude on stage in a dress, right? Those are hugely different, sort of, because those histories of as soon as you put a woman on stage, she was sexually compromised. Right. Good question. I like these questions. I can just geek out. Other questions? Yeah. Audrey. Interesting. So Audrey's question was about the sort of set of rules that govern like sports and competition versus the set of rules in theater and performance. So there's 2 different things, right? To a certain extent, theater is way more stodgy because we are traditionally, we have a script, right? Like we have a script. Like the folks that are playing football, they just have a playbook and they can do that play or that play or that play or that play. So on that end, there's sort of all of these rules. But I think like when it comes to just like the process of performance, I think that it's as unique as the sort of arena, right? Like if I'm going to talk to you about the rules of NFL, right? Or NCAA, which are worse. Then those are really tight, right? Those are really intense rules. But then if I were going to talk to you about, say, just to like, poke fun at my husband, competitive disc golf. He's a professional disc golf player. So like if I were going to talk about disc golf, right, there are certain rules that are there that are like a little more fluid. I would also say, to be the theater geek that I am, that Brecht would say, Bertolt Brecht, would say that those rules in sports actually allow sports audiences to own that product more than theater audiences. That the problem with theater audiences is that we're just fed Hamlet, the same script, over and over the centuries. And we're like, oh my God, right? But that it makes theater into an elite art form, because if you don't get the nuances of Hamlet, can you really enjoy it as much as someone else? Whereas all those different rules of sports allow you to sort of come up with, well, who's, like my son asked me the other day, so who do you think is the greatest NBA basketball player of all time? He's 12. And I was like, LeBron James. And he was like, that is the answer of somebody who doesn't watch basketball, Mom. Right. And it's because my son at 12 can already spout statistics, right? Can already sit there and be like, well, LeBron James can do this, this, and this, and this. But, right, this other guy, I can't even remember his name. It's bad fan. This other guy can do this, 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 and this. And so all of that data that comes along with sports allows the audience to sort of create their own idea of who is the greatest, of all time. And so you can make it into something that's more user friendly. Nobody asks you to go to a basketball game and be quiet and turns off the lights. So, you know, and don't talk to your neighbors and turn off your cell phones, and whatever you do, don't say anything loud. Right. So some would say that those rules are sort of not good for the arts, right? Artists, I would say, would be like, it is so nice to go into a space where it is quiet and all I have to do is focus on that screen or that stage. I don't know if I answered your question, but cool. Thanks. Appreciate it. Appreciate it, y'all. Yeah, Steve. Question from the internet. Ooh. So the question was, can you please point to the sports that have done the best in terms of racial equity and social justice, and can that be applied to the arts? So I will tell you that one of the things in the pandemic, and I did another talk about this, is that, man, theater kind of stunk and how it navigated the pandemic versus sports. Like, sports figured out all of these ways to make the game happen. That's in part because, like, you can't transition a basketball game to Zoom, right? You can't do those things. But I think particularly now, and especially I'm going to point right to the NBA, right? After last week and what happened in Texas, the first person that they were citing was Steve Kerr, right? A basketball coach, right? So the fact that, and I think too, the NFL is sort of a little behind in the pandemic and in the wake of the George Floyd murder, that the NBA was like, we want our players to be able to do whatever they want to do. You want to paint Black Lives Matter on the floor? Awesome, do it, right? And I feel like the NFL has been reticent to do that. Now, if you look at the statistics, there's a huge racial gap, not necessarily in the players of those two sports, but in the audiences, right? So the NFL is working with a majority white audience in a way that the NBA is not. So I think that those two, and I think that the lessons learned from how the NBA navigated the pandemic, navigated the kind of crises that we are in, and enabled their players to feel empowered is something that I think theater missed the boat on. I can't speak to like music and stuff like that, but like theater made a whole lot of promises because we were all shut down. We're like, we're going to come back and we're going to be better and stronger and more equitable, and we're going to come up with better rules so that everybody can have healthcare and like people aren't broke and eating ramen when they're performing on Broadway. But like, we haven't seen that yet, really. Now, it took us longer to get back online, but it's like the faucet was turned off and now everybody just wants the faucet to be sort of turned back on. And there is evidence, I will say, if you look at the Tony nominations for this year, that there is a change, at least on Broadway. But most folks will tell you that Broadway is a good, barometer to some extent, but Broadway is not what most theater is, right? Most theater is nonprofit, we're just trying to sort of break even at the end of the day. And that's actually where most actors and most cultural workers work, right? They don't work in the place where we hope to make a profit off of it. And that's also the difference, I think, between behemoths like the NFL. Did you know the NFL is a nonprofit organization? The NFL is a nonprofit organization. All of the things around the NFL, right? The owners, the people who own the stadiums are not a nonprofit organization, but the NFL is a nonprofit organization, right? So they can say that they're not in it for the money, but of course the money is like sort of all around them. So I think theater actually has a little bit more to learn from how sports has navigated this than the other way around. And maybe I'm just cranky and crotchety and it was a bad year. But I would like to see more from theater. And I think that the answer to that, and I've said this to my students, they'll be like, oh yeah, Walsh, we've heard this, is that I think it's actually going to come out of community theaters, because community theaters were the first ones to stage plays again. Community theaters were the ones that were actually the least impacted because they already don't pay their people. Right? So they're like, cool, awesome, you're already a volunteer anyway, but we know you don't want to die, so you don't need to come to work, but then you can come back and not get paid as soon as you want to come back. right? So I think, but it's because the people that are in community organizations are in it because of the efficacy of participating in it, right? And so I think that might be, I hope that that's actually that grassroots sort of, if we listen down to community theaters and let them build and rebuild the infrastructure, because I don't know that regional theaters are going to get back online. They're struggling a lot. Other questions? Yes, in the back, Brandon. So the question was from Brandon about like, there's all these similarities, like why does our culture continue to insist that they're just not at all alike? And actually, and this is I've written about this too, that we're actually in an antagonistic relationship, right? And I think that right, I cite like Meryl Streep got up at the Golden Globes a few years ago and was like, you need Hollywood and you need theater because without us, everything would just be wrestling and football. Right? And everybody laughed. And everybody in wrestling and football was like, what are you trying to say? Right? So I think that part of it is cultural, right? My professor, looking back at Greece, like sports and arts were sort of on equal footing in Greece. But especially theater, I think has just been devalued in a lot of different ways and for a lot of different reasons, right? I think that it's considered elite. I think you could say this of art, the visual arts too, that it's considered sort of stuffy and elite and it's expensive, right? In a way that like, that is not the case with sports, but also demand. Everybody wants sports all the time. So, you know, my kid can play whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And I have to find really specific theater things for my kids to do. So I think it's about value. I think that in our culture, sports just means a lot in our sort of Western culture. And I think that part of it has to do with the way that it is about masculinity. I think a part of it is about the way in which we understand who we are through our sports teams, right? Like the Patriots, America's team. And the way that it is sort of constructed as an escape that is reachable in any way. Like maybe you can't afford to go to an NFL game, but you can totally go to your high school football game. I mean, look at high school football games in Texas. They're bigger than the NFL, right? When I got here and I was like, oh my gosh, LSU is a bigger deal than the Saints. Don't tell the Saints that. But I was like, there are more people who have LSU swag on their doors in Baton Rouge in particular than anywhere else. And that was not the case when I've lived in other football towns, right, that have had Denver Broncos, even though they have a great football team at CSU and CU. So I think that it's about value. I think that one of the things that the arts have tried to figure out is like, how do we make ourselves more accessible to the community? How do we make it something that is owned? And that sense of identification can happen. And I do think that part of it is like, you know, when you go to Tiger Stadium, you can do whatever the heck you want. Right? You can yell, you can paint your face, you can be as loud as you want, you can be as quiet as you want, you can eat food, you can get beer. We don't do that at Broadway plays. You don't get to shout at your favorite, you know, person on stage. So I think that that's also that's a part of it, that I think that theater needs to loosen up a little bit and figure out ways. It doesn't have to be like sports, right? But there's got to be something in between going to see a Broadway show and going to see improv. There's got to be something in between, right? Because why aren't people flocking to improv? I don't know. Improvers. Yes. I know. Rocky Horror Picture Show. That was that, right? So, and I think that, right. And I think that, and I will tell you, right, that, you know, when my students are like, so Dr. Walsh, what do you think the future of all of this is? Because I think the financial system that upholds regional theaters is collapsing. I don't think that it was actually very durable to begin with. And the ones that are thriving are theaters that are homeless, that don't have a space that they perform in, that are, so they sort of have an office and they create their own work based on what is happening in the world at the time. And they take a long time to develop those things. And then they perform them in front of audiences for a reasonable amount. And then they tour that everywhere. They tour it to international festivals. They tour it around the country. They tour it to colleges. And that has created, because I have a friend that is a part of, it's called Elevator Repair Service in New York. And they are one of those theaters, and their artists stay because there's a sustainable sort of amount of money. They're not paying rent on some Broadway house, and people, they go where they're wanted. And that creates the sort of buzz that they need. And I think that we're going to have to start thinking about in theater, like ways to do more immersive stuff that is about the community and in the community, that allows the community to see themselves without making them feel super awkward. Because when I say immersive theater, I'm like, I don't want people to come in and tell me, why don't you participate in this, sir? No, I didn't pay money to come and do this, right? I paid money to come and listen to somebody talk to me. So it's about changing those expectations about what theater could be and should be. Is that my like? Okay, thanks everybody.
Let's give a big round of applause. Thank you, that was great. So at some point during the summer, you and I have to have a really long conversation about music and theater and sports, because there's so much more. I will just say, without going into the whole details of it, musicians, and I know that actors feel the same way, that when they're on stage, they're competing with themselves for the best kind of performance and to not screw up. And that in and of itself is a competition that I think athletes also have. So, exactly. So we have a lot to talk about, but thank you. Again, big round of applause for Dr. Walsh. So I'm sure you are all wondering who gets the lovely Science Friday radio nerd. And the winner is Melanie Newcomb. Come on, big round for Melanie. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your help. Thank you for watching online. Thank you to our friends at the Varsity for everything. Please come back next month. We have a great discussion with the director of the T. Harry Williams Center for Oral History, Jennifer Kramer. She's going to be talking about how we preserve the history of our world through talking and through listening to people. It's going to be an absolutely great show on June 28th, a month from today, at the end of June. Hope to see you there. Until then, thank you very much. Have a wonderful summer, and we'll see you next month.